Hello and welcome to Black, Brown, and Bilingue, where our mission is to unite the Black and Brown communities through education, storytelling, and community engagement.
The vision of Black, Brown, and Bilingue is to be part of creating a world in which Black and Brown identities are affirmed, bilingualism and biculturalism are nurtured, and equity is the driving force behind all that we do. Thank you for joining us again today. I am Lissette Jacobson, and I am one of your hosts.
And I'm Maurice McDavid. I'm your other host.
I am thrilled to introduce our next guest. It has been for me, like a long time coming. It's been a bucket list item. And so we are thrilled to have Felix Sanchez with us today. For over 25 years, Felix Sanchez has worked at the intersection of politics and entertainment, promoting Hispanic and other diverse voices in the media. He co-founded the National Hispanic Foundation for the Arts, NHFA, in 1997 with actors Jimmy Smits, Sonia Braga, Esai Morales, who is so cute, and Miguel Julia. The organization seeks to advance the presence of Latinos in the media, telecommunications, and entertainment industries. Since its inception, NHFA has served the nation through diversity promotion, groundbreaking studies, graduate school partnerships, talent and content development, patronizing the arts, promoting civil rights in the digital age, training corporations, and monitoring the media. Felix has also served on the national presidential campaigns and worked on Capitol Hill. The National Hispanic Foundation for the Arts is the leading national Hispanic organization to advance the presence of Latinos in the media, telecommunications, and entertainment industries. Welcome to Black, Brown, and Bilingue. Felix Sanchez, welcome to Black, Brown, and Bilingue.
Thank you, Lissette and Maurice. I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you again for joining us. We are, again, very excited to have you and just amazed at the work that you have done. And I think it is really important work and perhaps work that I didn't even think about how important it was until I started to read some of the things that you've written and to watch some of the specials, and all of a sudden it hit me like, no, this is important work. How much of culture is impacted by the things that we see in entertainment and some of those things. So, Felix, a lot of the work that you do, you kind of focus or center around this idea of underrepresentation. Can you talk a little bit about that, what that means to your work, and why this is indeed important work that you're doing?
Well, so much of this is really foundational to the Latino community, to all of our communities of color, precisely because Hollywood builds a narrative and they define who we are. And they've defined who we are in various ways over time. I mean, it's no wonder that Asian Americans are suffering the kind of injustice that they are suffering, not just because of the COVID virus, but historically their portrayal in television and in film has, made them very subservient and very cartoonish. And these are roles that Hollywood created. Think about Charlie Chan and all of those early, 50s, 60s films that continue to perpetuate this kind of image. So we know what it's done for the Black community and the Latino community. We know the tropes and the stereotypes that are out there. And the only way that it changes is by us being able to tell authentic, original stories. And that is, the conundrum that goes on here. I mean, the University of Southern California did a study in which they looked at Latino portrayal over 12 years. And out of that numbers of ethnic and racial roles that they found, Latinos were about 4.7% of the total of actors in films, of the top 100 films over 12 years, where we are 18.5% of the population. So you see the disparity that goes on, and it doesn't take much to light a match. And I think that's what we saw in the previous administration. They lit the match to what was already a bonfire ready to occur. And so, the struggle now is to regain our own identity and to present it in a way that shows us who we are today, not who people imagined us to be 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm. In one of your specials, you talk about how for Latinos, there's representation that comes in little bursts, right?
Yes.
And I started to reflect, like, who were those role models that I saw growing up? I immediately thought of like Edward James Olmos, who I love. I thought about then kind of like Selena, and then after Selena, like then J-Lo. So it has happened in little bursts, but especially for Mexican Americans, because we are the biggest population within the Latino community, yet I feel like we get so underrepresented in the media. Why do you think that is? In particular to the Mexicanos and Mexicanas?
Yeah, I think for a long time, Hollywood thought Latinos don't watch English language TV, they watch Spanish language TV. And so they didn't understand the multiculturalism, they didn't understand the multi-generational issue that comes in as a component. And I remember, I think it was 1999, I was talking with the then president of ABC Entertainment, and we were talking about the success of Desperate Housewives and Eva Longoria's role. And I said to him, and mind you, these are individuals who know Hollywood, the history, in minutia. I mean, they could get on Jeopardy and win every category because they know it, so well. And I said to him, do you realize that Eva Longoria is the most recognizable and visible Latina ever on TV? And he was shocked and he said, what do you mean? I said, tell me another actress who is Latina, who is from television, not film or Broadway, but just television, who has had a bigger footprint than Eva is having on Desperate Housewives. And of course, there was no answer. That there were others who had tiny little roles here and there. There was a character from Marcus Welby, MD, who played a nurse, Elena, on the show, but she was not a lead, and she was not at the level of what Eva had done, and it showed how desperate people were to see those kinds of images, how Latinos flocked to the television, how authentically she portrayed herself, how she wouldn't, budge from her identity, how she insisted on being, culturally who she was throughout the show. And that was a huge turning point, because previously Jessica Alba, for example, was in a show called Dark Angel on Fox. And when we were talking with Fox and they were putting together their demographics in terms of how many Latino actors and writers and directors they had, they listed her as multicultural. And I said to the head of diversity at Fox, why do you list her as multicultural? And she says, because she self-identifies as multicultural. And agent and managers would tell their actors, do not get yourself in a pigeonhole. And they didn't want her to be, because they knew that playing a Latina on TV was a bad, was all downhill. There was no upside.
Right. She'd be typecast.
She would be typecast because that's all it had been in the past. Mm. So much of this is that people were fighting a system that wouldn't allow them to be outside of the parameters of their roles. I mean, one of the few has been Rita Moreno, who was able to translate her acting, life into very different mainstream roles. But, it happened so late in life for her. Think about how long it took for her. Think about Isai Morales, who in 1987, he did La Bamba. Mm-hmm. And La Bamba was made 100 million worldwide. And in that, in the show, the film, was worldwide a success, but he could not find roles that, brought him forward until he did Ozark, and is now going to play another villain in Mission Impossible 7. But I mean, he's going to play opposite Tom Cruise in what is a huge, multi-million-dollar film, the biggest opportunity that it's come. But think how long it took from 1987 to, 2021 to have that opportunity. So it's not like we were not ready and waiting in the wings. Is that we were denied systematically. Talk about institutional racism. We have lived it. We know this. I recently wrote a letter to the editor of the Washington Post because they basically had said that the 2021 Oscar nominations were the most diverse ever. And I said, well, yes, if you remove Latinos from that equation, it is the most diverse. But if Latinos are important to diversity and inclusion, then it's historically one of the worst Oscar nominations, that we've had historically. And that's what people don't know is when they talk about diversity, they're not thinking about Latinos. And that has been at the fore. And yet we over-index for media, and we are 25% of the box office, even though we are 18.5% of the population. So, but we have to still educate our community as to why representation matters, why portrayal matters, how it impacts their children, how it impacts them getting jobs, how it impacts people think of them when they go into a department store. All of these things have to get understood in the context of depiction and portrayal, because how we're perceived is how people see us when we walk in the door for a job interview, when your first day of school, starting high school, auditioning for a spring play, all the roles that people think, well, you're not really right for that role, because it was played by, on Broadway by a white person. Mm-hmm. And we've seen how people like Lin-Manuel Miranda has changed the equation on Broadway and has brought forth new ideas and a new way of being able to bring audience to talent. Because it's really, once you have that opportunity, the sky's the limit. And we hope that this year we'll have In the Heights and we'll have West Side Story to really reflect our community as we know it today.
So I know that, you mentioned it tonight, the 25% purchasing power in the box office. And that idea that purchasing is happening, even though that representation is not there. I wonder sometimes if that's not because, again, we want to go watch something, right? We want to be able to relax. We've worked hard through the week. We want to be able to do something. So I'm wondering, as you think back to your lifelong experience of having watched TV and having watched movies, what are some of those moments that you can think back to where you're like, finally, I saw something that told my story? Or maybe what are some of those moments on the other end where you're like, this is not it. I'm tired of seeing this same story.
I know. Maurice, you bring up such a good, you bring up such a good issue about what are some of the stories that, really do resonate within the Latino community, and why do we go see, Tom Cruise over going to see, someone like Nicholas Gonzalez, or why haven't we, built up new images that compete in the same way for scripts and for roles and for narratives? I think part of it is that there's an uncomfortableness in the fact that Latinos are not in the C-suites, and by the C-suites, I mean the CEO, the CFO, the chief marketing officer. All the titles that begin with C are the C-suites. And we don't have people or enough Latino or people of color in those roles to be able to, stand up to the financiers of films who are accustomed to one type of film. And we have a problem with the exterior communication and the interior communication to the interior message to our own community. It's hard because if Latinos have not seen themselves for over 50 years on television and in film, they don't have an expectation that they should see more Latinos in film. The Black community knows that and has understood that for a very long time, why representation is important, why the first weekend box office of a new film is important to attend. But the Latino community still sort of, it doesn't really think about it in those terms. And Hollywood says, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And they know that this demographic is going to show up for, every major, Godzilla versus Kong film that's shown in theaters. But we get sidetracked because so many of our roles get whitewashed. For example, just about 10 days ago, there was a story that ABC was casting for a pilot for a show called Maggie. And the show, the character had a Spanish surname, but they sent out they wanted to audition talent of any race and any ethnicity for that role. And they wound up with, not surprisingly, a non-Latina in that role. And so there was an immediate, uproar about the fact that they had a Latina character and they chose a non-Latina character to play that role. And their answer was that it was really not, it was just a place note, a place marker. The name was a place marker. And because they had gone out for any race and any ethnicity for that role, they really weren't thinking that it had to be a Latina in that role. And the argument was that then that they might bring in the Latina for the best friend role. And they confirmed that no, none of the Latinas that they had seen were being invited back for the best friend role. So we neither got the lead role or the supporting roles. I mean, this is part of the problem, that still happens, where there's no clarity and there's always haze around these decisions. And at the end of the day, what can you can't force them to do something that they, they've decided from a business perspective to do it this way. But those are the hurdles that we still have. So
you said a lot, right? What do you think is the reason why we don't or aren't as educated about these issues? And because I've often thought about, like, what can I do to get Latinos to be upset about this? How can we hit them where it hurts, which is that bottom dollar. Don't go to these films. Do not go to opening weekend and spend your money on films that aren't showing us in our wholeness, in our entirety. And we're just such passive people, it feels like. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
It's such a complex, I really, I battle with how to message to this community about this topic. Mm-hmm. Because once you get buy-in, I mean, if we had the kind of buy-in that the African-American community has about representation and depiction, we would be, a very strong force to be dealt with. But the fractionalism and the very fact that, that there has been that there's little expectation that there should be, a Latino character or narratives, etc., is part of the problem, and that we don't have a single narrative.
The immigrant.
Where the immigrant is the fallback role and a theme that occurs. And yes, but there are so many other storylines, that should be, explored. And that's one of the reasons that the National Hispanic Foundation for the Arts has worked with 8 universities at the graduate school level to promote that talent into the industry at NYU, Columbia, Yale, Harvard, Northwestern, USC, UCLA, and the University of Texas at Austin. And we've worked with this group of working on their, MA in film or television or theater, and tried to, present them as the cream of the crop, which they are, to the industry. And yet with all of those credentials, with all of that training, they still find it hard to get into these jobs. And part of it is the guilds, which are the unions, the Writers Guild, the Directors Guild, the Actors Guild. All of these unions make it very, very difficult to cross over to the other side and to become a member of those guilds. And if you're not a member, you cannot work in the industry. You can be an independent producer and produce independent content and max out, your credit cards so that you can try to duplicate what Robert Rodriguez did with $7,000 to create his first film. But the odds are against you. The odds are against you to be able to make that kind of hurdle jump, that's required. So much of this right now, we've been working with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. And one of the bills that recently passed was the National Apprenticeship Program. And the apprenticeship program pays the apprentice and it pays the employer. So now the guilds could have a way to create a program where not only above the line, but below the line, the sound guy, the lighting guy, the gaffer, the best boy, all of these roles are very solid middle-class jobs. And they could, create this apprenticeship program that they would not even have to pay for, that the federal government would pay for, and it would train individuals, because you can't learn this stuff in class. This is an on-the-job learning program. And the other above the line is, assistant directors, assistant, writers. There's so many roles there that you have to be in the business to understand how it works and to learn firsthand, but you've got to get on the other side of the fence. So, what we face is we're locked out. I mean, the border locks us out. Hollywood locks us out. And this is the part that people don't understand. The right uses harsh rhetoric against us, but the left marginalizes us and invisibilizes us so that we are not relevant to either side. So we are smashed in the middle of a no-win situation. Mm-hmm. And yet this issue should not be a Democrat or Republican issue. It should really be about fairness. It should be about depicting America the way we are. And it should be an acknowledgement that Latinos are not just recently arrived, that we are here. I mean, you think about the Cuban community and their experience. You think about the Puerto Rican community, that every Puerto Rican is a U.S. citizen, regardless of whether they're born in the United States or in Puerto Rico. The Mexican-American experience, the multi-generational, and, the Central American experience that came here because of war that we initiated. Mm-hmm. I mean, that history of the Western Hemisphere is not understood. And while we focus on China and 1 billion people in China, we're 1 billion people in the Western Hemisphere. If we could unite those economies, and I think that one of the few that is getting it is Netflix, because they have developed programming with Spanish language content that is appealing to U.S. Latinos who are bilingual or Spanish dominant or bilingual. And they're appealing to content that is for millennials and Gen Xers on the U.S. side. Mm-hmm. So they're really looking at this audience, and they understand our numbers, and they understand their geographic positioning to Latin America, and they're taking full advantage of that. And so, that is where I think the market is going to start to go, and I think we're going to see a lot of changes coming up pretty quickly. Just because Netflix is going there. If Netflix was not going there, it would stay static and stay the same.
Yeah, you touched upon a lot of important topics, one of them being the idea of invisibility. And that is something that as a Mexicana, as a Chicana, I have felt not just through the media, but in my education. It's like I was learning, about the founding fathers, but I was also learning about the Underground Railroad. But where were we? It was nowhere. And to see that also be the case in the media, as an educator, that is a big frustration for me, because when I try to encourage my students to pursue careers and things like that, I can't really broaden their horizons, because you can't be what you can't see. And so if you're not out there and visible, it's hard to have your students and young people aspire to be those things, because they know that the odds are stacked against them.
I go back to the expression querer es poder, where there's a will, there's a way. Mm-hmm. And I do think that it is about perseverance, and it is about determination. Mm-hmm. And that isn't always easy, because, it takes this very strong-willed individual to stick with it after rejection, after rejection, after rejection. And, and families don't understand this. Families think, you should be a doctor, you should be a lawyer. Well, yes, those were good careers a long time ago, and they still are good careers. But careers in the entertainment media industry is equally lucrative. And that is what, so we need more support. They look at the arts, and they look at, acting or producing or directing as being soft. But it's a hard industry. And it is very recession-proof. We're seeing right now that even with the lull and the stopping of production and everything that's going on, the industry is going to bounce back. And we will be in theaters very soon. So the very fact that young people want to go into this industry, more families and parents should be supportive of them, because it is possible. I mean, I think about all of the talent that is on Instagram or TikTok, so many of the social media platforms that are unique to young people. They are so talented, and so many of them are coming from the minority community. I mean, non-minorities find it really interesting to watch minorities. Which just to say that, this generation doesn't look at life in the bifurcated, segregated world that other generations have looked at it. So this generation is one of the most open and progressive that we have ever seen in anyone's lifetime. And so, and we don't distinguish, we don't see as many things, being different. We're not afraid of talking to someone of a different culture or a different race, or being friends with someone of a different culture or a different race. In fact, we embrace that. Yeah. And so that is where the opportunity is coming, because this is the market that the entertainment industry has to focus on. And they're the leaders of choice. They're the choice makers, the taste makers of today's society.
And the podcast listeners, millennials love podcasts.
I forgot about podcasts. Exactly. I listen to podcasts at the gym all the time. And, it really is informative, and it gives you information that you wouldn't get anywhere else. Mm-hmm. I mean, you wouldn't have this. Where have you heard this conversation anywhere else?
Right.
And that was our pitch too. We're like, he's Black, I'm brown, and we're both bilingual, and so it just works.
It's great. I'm so glad for you.
So as I was preparing for this interview, Mr. Sanchez, I was thinking about this idea, and you mentioned it, right? I think the Black community definitely like if there's a movie, when Get Out came out, Black people were like, we have to go see Get Out, right? Because we're going to go support this brother. It's about us. It's a horror movie that centers Black people. Like, we're going to go do that.
Selma, Black Panther, all of those films.
When Black Panther came, look.
People were taking field trips. Schools were taking their students on field trips for it.
The Hate U Give, when it came out, again, I went on a field trip. So, two things. you mentioned Black Panther, and so I do want to go to Disney here for a moment, because I do watch as some of these larger studios do attempt to tell this story or do attempt to do this. And the thing about that is when Disney made Black Panther, Disney made a lot of money.
Yeah, well, they made a lot of money with Coco.
And that's where I was going next, was Coco is legitimately one of my favorite Disney movies of all time. And they made a lot of money with Coco. Now, they used some Latino voice actors, and there were some Latinos that were part of directing and producing. At the end of the day, though, Disney made a lot of money.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about when Malcolm X, the movie, was made. Mm-hmm. And the story, that's this folklore that's grown around the production of Malcolm X, the movie, because they ran out of money and they went to rich Black people and were like, hey, if we want to tell this story, we need money. And people wrote checks and produced this movie. So then that brought me to this idea of the Latino dollar and the power that is there. And as you mentioned already, 25% of the box office. How is there a way to take that and turn that into, rather than having to go to somebody else to make that movie, is there enough power? Can that be an end goal of saying, hey, why don't we start a Latino filmmaking? And that way you come to us and we'll go to you and we'll make our own stuff. And I don't have to ask Fox. I don't have to ask Disney,
Yeah. And I just want to add one more thing to that. Like, I was thinking throughout this conversation of like Tyler Perry, who got sick and tired of, waiting for a seat at the table. He said he built his own. In your opinion, do you think we have someone that would be the equivalent of like a Tyler Perry?
Well, Tyler Perry's president of his company, I forgot his first name, but the last name is Areu, A-R-E-U. They took over his old studios and created the Areu Brothers Studios in Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And they are working to do what Tyler Perry did with the Latino community. And I wish them all of the luck that there is. Part of the problem, Maurice, is that you talk about current day and Malcolm X and going to wealthy African Americans to underwrite the final, the finish of the film. Latinos are at least 20, if not 30 years behind the Black experience. We don't have the success. We don't have the proven track record that all Latino films are going to be successful and thus provide a rate of return for that investment. So people who have, made money this is not the first place they want to invest in. They probably would invest in Coca-Cola or Apple before they would invest, in a film, just because it took them so long to make that money that it's hard for them to part with it for something that could be an unsure bet. And that's part of the problem. We have the Areu brothers in Atlanta who are basically associated with Tyler Perry and are trying to create for the Latino community what Tyler Perry has done for the Black community. But so many times, because Latinos who made money are more apt to invest in Apple than in a Latino film, because it's not a sure thing. And they're business people, and entertainment is a business. And they want to know that their dollar, their investment, is going to have a good rate of return, not just get back their money that they put in, but to get a rate of return. And so it's complicated. Many times people say, why don't we just start all over? Well, you can't compete with billions of dollars that are already in the infrastructure of the entertainment industry and expect to make it work. I mean, one example is Robert Rodriguez, who started El Rey Network. And while Robert has done a lot of successful things, it has been very hard for him to maintain this cable channel and get distribution, and to have fair carriage.
What is that? I'm sorry.
Well, if when you think about your cable, if you had cable, because now you may have cut the cord on all of this, but if you had cable and you had Fios or you had Comcast or you had, Spectrum, to see what is on the schedule, the shows have to have carriage by those providers, those cable providers. And if you don't have carriage, well, then how can people see you? Mm-hmm. And the cable companies don't want to put on channels that are not drawing eyeballs, because it's kind of like they can make more money from somebody else who's drawing eyeballs than from someone who's not. So the challenge is enormous to kind of build your own, empire. And we should really be demanding from the Disneys of the world that they should do more, and while, after Coco, Disney did not have, as far as I know, anything in, following in the pipeline. They were lucky that they bought 20th Century Fox, and that 20th Century Fox was already doing West Side Story. And now West Side Story will come out under the Disney umbrella and under the banner of Disney. But, after that, what do we have coming up next?
Right.
The same thing with Warner Media. Warner Media has In the Heights. Mm-hmm. But what do they have coming up after that? What's in the pipeline? We get one film every 10 years. Yeah. And then we get nominated, and then the Academy Awards say, well, you got nominated in 2018. Okay, well, thank you.
But we're supposed to be satisfied with little breadcrumbs. That really is what.
And what they do is then they pepper the awards with Latino presenters. So then they bring out Jennifer Lopez and they bring out, Javier Bardem, and they bring out Penelope Cruz. They're not nominated for anything, but this is, a sort of distraction, to say, well, we have them on the show, well, yeah, but if you're not making films with Latino narratives that star Latinos in these sort of A-list roles, they're never going to get nominated for anything.
Yeah. So when you talk about starting to demand more of these roles, how can we do that? What can a typical person like me do to really start to demand that? Because when One Day at a Time was canceled, I was devastated. Mm-hmm. I thought it was well written. It was funny. The characters were good. I was just heartbroken when One Day at a Time was canceled. But I felt like, other than actually watching the shows, that there's nothing else I can do. What can we do?
Well, I think that, Gloria Calderon-Kellett, the executive producer of the show, the showrunner, was very astute in using social media, especially Twitter, to get this point across. Even if we're not talking about having to have thousands of followers, but if you have 20 followers and 20 followers retweet you on something that you're all in agreement with, I think it really helps. And I think I was watching a segment on CNN, and one of the anchors has a book out called Huddle. And she was talking about how Huddle was this new way of where women, young women, and women in industries together are coming together to support each other and in ways. And I think that if Latinos could create, a Latino huddle in entertainment, where we do more things that discuss this conversation and get the nuts and bolts of information to the public. The public doesn't have this understanding of the media at all.
No.
And we should be taking marketplace issues to the audience of Black and brown community that feel underrepresented in television and film.
Yeah, that's super powerful. And again, social media has changed, I think, our ability, to connect directly to the people. Who are making these decisions, for better or for worse, as we saw in the last presidency, right? For better or for worse. I think we would be remiss if we did not take an opportunity and step back just a little bit and really, Lissette and I are both school principals during the day. That's our day job, and our night job too, because being a principal doesn't end at the daytime. But we love getting a chance to talk to incredibly impressive people like you. But I bring up our role as educators because you have a past as an educator. So can you talk a little bit just about how like you moved from like an educator to law and then politics and then kind of this place now where you're kind of a big deal. I don't know.
Yeah, that's my dream trajectory. How did you do it? Show me the way.
Well, I think it was, I remember when I grew up in San Antonio, Texas. And I remember I was at a college prep school. This is, the most hysterical part about it. It was an all-boys school. And yet we were getting towards graduation, and I hadn't really applied anywhere for college. And so my father, who was a barber, had a client who was the dean of students at St. Mary's University. And so it's like, all of a sudden it was like, where am I going to go to college? And my father said, let me call John Michel. So he called him and he said, Felix Jr. doesn't know where he should go to school at next year. And he said, tell him he's coming to St. Mary's. That's how I got to St. Mary's for my first year. But it wasn't what I wanted because, I wanted to live in the dorm and I wanted to be away from home. And so I applied to go to the University of Texas at Austin, which was 80 miles away. And I found out at the very last minute, the year later, that I had been accepted. And when I got to UT, it was, a world away from everything that I knew, but I felt so comfortable there. I always adapted really, really well. And so I did a master's degree through Teacher Corps, and I was elementary, kindergarten, and bilingual certified. And I taught kindergarten and first grade.
Get out! You're joking.
Yeah. And it was, I have 12 hours in dissertation left on my PhD in early childhood education. And so it was, so much of this was, I was just enthralled by that age period, and it made so much sense to me. But I realized also that while I was, getting this master's degree, that I was more of an advocate than I was, a teacher. And so I applied to law school and went to law school, and then I came back to work in Austin. And when I was in Austin, I got offered the job to come work at the U.S. Senate for a senator from Texas, the last Democratic senator from Texas, Lloyd Bentsen. And I got here, and it was in the first weekend I had adjusted. It was like, I love this place. I'm staying. Usually people come and then they get homesick and they want to go home, and there's such a revolving door of people who come to work on the Hill, and they here for 2 years or so, and then they go back home. I never saw that as the way, as for me. And I just immersed myself because I always loved politics. There were two things that I did, that I always did, which was I always watched the Oscars, and I always watched the Democratic and Republican conventions, every 4 years. Some people did the Olympics, but, I was engrossed in, Democratic conventions, no matter how late they finished, because they weren't really made for TV at the time. But when in 1988, when Dukakis was the nominee for the Democratic Party, Lloyd Bentsen, whom I had worked for, was the vice president on the ticket. And so then I was asked to go to Boston and be the liaison between the presidential and the vice presidential campaign. And in that capacity, I also created the first Latino outreach from a Democratic presidential campaign ever.
Wow.
And then they asked me to create a Latino celebrity fly around, which was to take a plane a small plane, and to travel to the key demographic areas to gin up the base. And somehow, without a cell phone, IMDb, or the internet, I hired a jet and got the talent to get on the plane with me and go to all across the country before the presidential election. So, and then I duplicated that for other presidential elections, and it was really quite an experience. And that's how I had one foot in politics and one foot in entertainment and created the foundation.
That is so admirable. Who were some of the people that you were able to pull together?
Randy, what's the name of the guy who was on American Idol? Randy Jackson. He was one. Eric McCormack. Mm-hmm. There was a woman who was on ER with the time, and Jimmy Smits, and Isai Morales. And that's how I got to know them.
Can I tell you, Isai Morales on my family is like forever. Babe.
And let me tell you, he's as much fun as you think he is.
Oh, the way he played Chucho! Listen, I've been in love since I was a child.
Oh my God, he is very dynamic, very charismatic, very genuine, very smart, very well read, and he can talk the pants off anybody. I mean, really, no pun intended.
I say the same thing about Maurice, that he can talk the birds out of the trees.
That's a better way of saying it.
Yeah, that's a better. Use that one, Felix. Don't use the pants off.
I'm not talking pants off nobody.
It's how you can, talk the birds out of the trees. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So this is kind of a final question as we get ready to wrap up. So having this be Black, Brown, and Bilingue, Maurice and I, we would joke with each other, mostly me giving him a hard time about the Black-Brown divide. Like he would do something and I'd be like, oh, there you go, keeping the Black-Brown divide alive. And he'd be like, ay, loca. But, there was a report put out by your foundation that, and I'm just pulling a snippet out of it, that said that some interviewees pointed out that African Americans are also hesitant to advocate on behalf of Latinos for fear of losing their hard-fought yet still limited access. Can you speak to that a little bit more? Because we, in one of our episodes, we talk about how, unfortunately, there's this notion that there's only so much pie to go around, and that if I have a piece of the pie, I can't share with.
I think what people don't realize is that, when I was growing up, there were 3 networks. We didn't even have Fox, and then all of a sudden we had all this cable that came in, and all of that cable needed programming. And now we have streamers, and all of those streamers need programming. And we have smaller platforms for shorter content like YouTube and TikTok, all of Snapchat. All of this requires new content. So there is not a finite number, and it is not shrinking. The number is not shrinking; it is enlarging. And we haven't even talked about gaming and all of the content that gets developed for gamers, and all of this is living in a digital age, and I think we all know from being sequestered for a year plus that we turn to all of these digital products and old products. So there is so much. What we really need is collaboration. Mm-hmm. What we need is not silos of this is the Latino content and this is the Black content. I think that's why shows like Power on Stars are very, very popular, because they have an equal representation on the storyline between Latinos and African Americans. And ultimately, I can tell you that when I got to Washington, there were only 4 professional Latinos on staff. Out of 100 senators, there were 4. And the people that befriended me and from whom I was able to feel camaraderie with were the African American staffers who were greater in number, that were here. And again, as I said to you, we are, 20, 30 years behind the African American experience in media. And if we could create more collaboration, that is where I think we would find more gains, and it would be lucrative for everyone involved. And I think we would achieve higher goals and more interesting narratives than we've ever seen. And I see that all in the future coming down the pike.
¿Ves, Mauricio? ¿Ves? Te estoy diciendo.
Estoy de acuerdo, no es un problema para mí.
Sí, por eso cuando hicimos este podcast dije, ¿dónde va a haber una latina, un afroamericano juntos?
Juntos, hablando sobre temas contemporáneos.
Sí. Just saying.
I agree.
Well, we have just learned so much. We have. I feel like I'm challenged by that last piece there, that collaboration. I had just said that to somebody today, one of my staff members, talking about collaboration, not competition. And I think if we can get to a place where in both communities we understand that better, it will be very powerful. So thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Maurice.
And we're going to close out in a very typical way. We have a tradition on Black, Brown, and Bilingue where we ask our guests to leave the listeners with one final thought. If anyone makes it to the end of the episode, what would you want them to walk away with?
That the future is all within our grasp. It just takes being really prepared and getting all the educational training that you can get before you think about trying to find jobs in the industry, because this is really about a profession of people who are really prepared to be there. It's not just by finding somebody who's handsome or a woman who's beautiful, to be an actor or an actress. It's much more than that. It's the writer who tells a story like nobody else can tell it, and who can write dialogue that sounds like someone you've heard before in your life speaking.
Authentic.
And it's about the director who can position the narrative in a visual way, and the cinematographer that takes us deep into the eyes of the characters that we're listening to. So there's so much here, but it's not for the faint of heart, and it's not for people who can't accept rejection, and it's not for people who are not well prepared.
Excellent. Thank you so much. For Black, Brown, and Bilingue, I am Lissette Jacobson.
And I'm Maurice McDavid.
Muchas gracias for tuning in.